Well, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bea Spiller. I'm a lead senior economist at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm very delighted to welcome you today to this webinar. Today's conversation is the second in a series of webinars organized by the Environmental Defense Fund and Policy Integrity with the generous support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Environmental Defense Fund is a nonprofit environmental organization that uses science and economics to find practical and lasting solutions to some of the world's most pressing environmental problems. Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan academic think tank dedicated to improving the quality of governmental decision-making and who use economics and law to support smart policies for the environment, public health, and consumers. Given our organizational goals, Birch and Unel at IPI and I have been delighted to be working on a series of webinars highlighting the ongoing energy research funded by the Sloan Foundation. Our goal in these conversations is to bridge the gap between academic research and real-life policymakers. So with that goal in mind, each of these webinars invites academic researchers funded by the Sloan Foundation, as well as policy experts who work on these topics on a daily basis. These conversations are aimed at simultaneously helping inform policymakers with the latest insights from cutting-edge research and results in better policies, while also helping researchers identify open policy questions and better understand how they can focus their research for a higher policy impact. Within this backdrop, we will be discussing a topic today that is key to ensuring that we can bring about a clean energy grid, and that is public acceptance and governance in energy policy. It is of utmost importance that we achieve public support to be able to install the large amounts of renewables and transmission lines that are needed for us to achieve a net zero electric grid. So the webinar today will discuss how we can improve the process for achieving stakeholder acceptance and the implications for governance in the sector. Without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Elizabeth Wilson, who will be moderating today's discussion. Dr. Wilson is a professor of environmental studies and the inaugural director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. She studies how energy systems are changing in the face of new technologies and new societal pressures, and has recently examined how energy policy stakeholders view the opportunities and challenges of creating smart grids and decision-making within regional transmission organizations. So Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bea. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. In terms of how we're running the day today, we're going to be inviting our speakers. I'll be introducing them briefly, and then they'll be each giving 5 minutes of remarks on their research, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation. But I invite you, the audience, to please put any questions in the Q&A, and we'll have a facilitated question and answer period afterwards. So I'm excited to share with you who's going to be part of our conversation today. Amanda Orman has worked in energy and public policy for over 30 years in Arizona and the West. For the past 2 decades, she's managed a group at the Orman Group, LLC, a consulting firm specializing in education, advocacy, and lobbying for clean energy. She serves as director of the Western Grid Group, a West-wide non-governmental organization working to build the clean electric grid. Before starting her consulting firm, she was the director of Arizona's Energy Office, and where she was responsible for developing state energy policy and promoting energy efficiency, renewable energy, and alternative fueled vehicles. So welcome, Amanda. We also have Dr. David Koniski, who's a professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington. His research on U.S. environmental and energy policy is a particular favorite of mine, and his emphasis on regulation, federalism, and state politics and public opinion and environmental justice are really providing some important insights into how the field is emerging over time. Tanya Haikala is a professor and the co-director of the University of Colorado Denver's workshop on policy process research. Her research and teaching focus on policy processes and environmental governance. She's particularly interested in how conflict and collaboration arise in policy processes and what types of institutions support collaboration, learning, and conflict resolution. Her recent research is exploring these issues in interstate watersheds, ecosystem restoration programs, and unconventional oil and gas development, and siting of energy production and distribution infrastructure, which she'll be talking about today. And this research is also some that I think is critically important at a time of energy system transformation. Dr. Kate Konchnik is a senior lecturer and fellow at Duke Law School, and also head of the RTOgov Project. Her work focusing on options for public electric utility regulation and electricity market reforms, given emerging technologies and decarbonization goals, has really helped to shape how we think about RTOs in practice. She's currently working on a multidisciplinary research project studying how rules of regional transmission organizations and independent system operators can help or hinder change. And again, thinking about energy system change at a multi-scalar level will be something we'll be able to do with all of the people who are here in our conversation today. And in terms of order of presentations, we're going to start with Tanya and then go to Kate, followed by David and then Amanda. So Tanya, if you'd like to turn on your screen and give your 5 minutes of remarks, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
I would love to. Let me get my slideshow. Are you seeing my main screen here?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to present just a couple highlights from some work that I've been doing with my colleague, Chris Weibel here at the School of Public Affairs at CU Denver, and several of our graduate students looking at conflicts around energy infrastructure siting. And this work, we started a few years ago after having spent some time looking at conflicts around oil and gas development and realizing that a lot of the, I think, academic attention and often sometimes our theories and our advice for practitioners has been based on really the kind of high intensity conflict cases. And our kind of underlying hypothesis or expectation is that there's variance in the intensity of conflicts across different types of energy infrastructure types. And our goal was to try to understand some of that variance and try to understand where there's perhaps more intense conflict versus less intense conflict, and then look at some of the factors that might be associated with that. So one of the things we did was we used news and social media to assess indicators of conflict and attention to these various infrastructure siting issues. And we used a population of 619 projects that are shown here in terms of the different infrastructure types that had been either proposed, in progress, or completed in 2018. And so we also then mapped these out, as you can see here, to look at how these play out in terms of geographic location. And then we did some analyses with demographic data from these counties. So what you're seeing here are pictures of counties. And as shown in these maps, certain counties or regions of the US have higher clusters of conflict, of high intensity conflict, which are the colors in red, based on our coding from the media. But conversely, some of the regions or counties that you see here have lower intensity conflict as shown in the blue. And unlike the kind of general perception for the tendency that we would see high conflict over infrastructure siting, many of the siting projects that we studied had low conflict intensity. In fact, over 60% of the projects in this population were of lower conflict intensity. And then when we ran some of the analyses, some Poisson regression models looking at some of the characteristics of the county demographics that are associated with, and I will emphasize not causal necessarily, but associated with these levels of conflict intensity, we found a few interesting things. One of which is that, of course, conflict varies by project size, by location, and infrastructure type, with pipelines and wind projects having more intense conflicts than solar and transmission lines. We saw some patterns where higher conflict cases or projects were in counties that had higher levels of voters associated with the Democratic Party, except with transmission lines. And we also saw some patterns where in counties that had higher proportions of Black and Hispanic residents, we saw lower levels of conflict. This pattern varies kind of somewhat by infrastructure type, but it raises some important questions about environmental justice issues, perhaps, or access and voice in energy infrastructure siting. We also then selected a few cases, and I won't go into these here, but you can just see that we selected a small number of those cases from that larger population to look at news media discourse in more depth and to do some interviews. And we did 43 interviews and looked at over 1,000 newspaper articles to assess cases at these different levels of conflict for each of the infrastructure types. And we did various things with these data. I won't show all of them here, but just a couple highlights to show you what we looked at. One of which was, how do people who are engaged in the debates around these projects frame either their pro or anti sentiment, and how does that play out differently across infrastructure types? So as you see here, and across the different levels of conflict intensity. So projects with high conflict intensity, you'll see in the red, which not surprisingly has more statements that are made in the news media, but also more anti-sentiment, for example, relative to the pro. We also looked at the actors that were involved in these types of discourses in the news media and the variance in these actors and how they present pro or anti-sentiment. And a few of the kind of general findings from the news media analysis we did on these smaller case studies are that the types and positions of the actors or the participants in this discourse are somewhat similar. It's kind of the usual suspects. The opponents are the nonprofit organizations and members of the general public. Proponents tend to be energy companies. Governments often take different positions depending on the context or the infrastructure. We also saw that in high conflict cases that people from different positions often talk past each other, so they're not framing the issue in the same way. And finally, that this discourse can differ over the lifespan of projects. So with higher conflict projects, we might see more ongoing and competing discourse relative to medium or lower conflict projects. And with that, I will wrap up and say thank you, and in particular to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and our research assistants who did most of this work. Thank you.
This is really great. Thank you so much. And next we'll be hearing from Kate.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really excited. And thanks to the Sloan Foundation, who has supported a lot of our work. So the name of this panel discussion has public acceptance in it. One of the interesting things about regional transmission organizations, RTOs, and independent system operators is that before you even get to public acceptance, there's the issue of public awareness. So we like to say that RTOs are the most important players in the energy transition that you've never heard of. And that can be a problem in and of itself. Then once people hear about them, more challenges can flow. So RTOs are transmission organizations. They control transmission lines within a footprint. They run a number of different types of markets. They all run energy markets, and then they sort of have different markets from there, capacity sort of forward markets, and different sort of ancillary services, grid regulation, things like that. They are nonprofit entities for the most part. I think PJM, which is the largest market in the country, has some for-profit arms, but they are largely nonprofit organizations. They are considered public utilities under the Federal Power Act, and so they are ultimately overseen in one fashion or the other by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There are 6 of these FERC regulated markets in the United States today. There is a 7th in Texas, ERCOT, which is entirely within the borders of Texas, has very little transmission connectivity with the rest of the country. In fact, Texas has its sort of own interconnect, its own grid that is not synchronous with the 2 other grids in the United States. And so it is state regulated. So these 7 entities are these sort of strange creatures that yet have a front row seat in the energy transition. And so we'd started to see some conflicts occurring in these markets. Back east, a lot of people who otherwise had no idea what markets were started hearing about market conflict in PJM and in New England, particularly in the capacity auctions. States had a lot of climate and clean energy requirements, and so were either requiring or encouraging the construction of clean energy. Because of certain rules in these market capacity markets, a lot of those clean resources were not clearing the capacity auction. If a utility is part of one of the three markets in the East, they have to buy all of their future power through the market. And so we were ending up in a situation where we had a lot of excess capacity. So we had the sort of off the books clean energy that was being built because of state requirements. And then we still had utilities having to buy all of the power that they needed a few years forward from these RTO markets. So that started to sort of boil over in the same way that about 10 years ago, the public started learning about what FERC was, because FERC was involved in the approval of natural gas pipelines. And so suddenly there were protests in front of FERC headquarters, whereas before that was a really sort of under the radar federal agency. RTOs also are starting to bubble a little bit to the surface. And we were finding that in the academy, there was a growing interest in, we should study these creatures. What are they? They're sort of these quasi-governmental organizations that in 7 different ways try to reach some sort of consensus or through some sort of voting system, changes in market rules that create and destroy value. So they create eligibility requirements for who can even bid into auctions and determine then how much value that a particular resource, whether it's a coal-fired power plant or a solar array or battery storage, what kind of value they can expect to get from that market. So we were finding there's conflict in these markets, wanted to know why, wanted to dig into more of like, what are these markets? Are they public? Are they private? Why are they having these conflicts? Are they just the same conflicts we're seeing in all parts of the energy space today? Just the sort of laboring just the challenges of transitioning to this cleaner market or cleaner future. And then are there ways we could change how the markets work in order to ease out some of this conflict or enable a smoother energy transition? So 2 big things that have come away from the RTOgov project. This project has been running for about 2 years now. We have a dozen peer-reviewed papers published in journals. One of the really interesting things about this project is its interdisciplinary nature. So we have researchers with engineering backgrounds, math backgrounds, economics, political science, law, and that sort of breadth of discipline means people get to come and look at these creatures and the conflict that is occurring in them from different perspectives, using different terminology, and yet creating sort of new ways of thinking about these organisms and how they might change. 2 big takeaways that have come out of this, and then we can dig deeper in questions and answers. One is just how odd these creatures are. So they started to arise in the 1990s and over 2000. Some of the more recent ones were put together about 10 years ago, but this was 60, 70, 80 years after the Federal Power Act had been written, and yet Congress didn't amend the statute to enable the creation of these 7 markets. Instead, FERC tried to organize or encourage more open wires so that transmission owners had to let other energy producers use their wires as sort of a common carrier to buy and sell power to third parties. And then FERC was trying to further encourage sort of regionalization of our grids and more centralized dispatch for more efficient operations. So they strongly encouraged the creation of these RTOs. They did not get congressional mandates, although that had been sought. And so this creates a couple of things. These are sort of these odd creatures derived out of a statute that had been around for a very long time. They are defined as public utilities, just like Duke Energy, First Energy, Xcel. Obviously very different, and yet it's that same part of the Federal Power Act that we find their sort of authority to be. They work through various consensus and decision-making processes as private nonprofit entities. In some cases, they are membership owned, so you have to pay to become a member and then to be part of that decision-making process. That's particularly in the Eastern markets. In the West, for instance, in California, it is not membership based. Instead, it's really staff driven. So the professional staff come up with rule changes that they think make sense, and then they go through a notice and comment period, almost as if they were a public agency, but they are not, and they're not subject to the same regulatory requirements. Ultimately, FERC gets to look at any changes that are made to market rules, and they are looking for things to be just and reasonable, to result in just and reasonable rates, and to make sure there's not undue discrimination between different types of power. But FERC has been somewhat limited in its oversight role through the DC circuit. So the federal courts have decided, we really like this bargaining that happens within these RTOs, and we think that that is a model that should be deferred to. And so FERC is allowed to say yes or no, so vote up or down on proposals, but can't get into, oh, I like this part, I don't like that part. So while there is federal oversight, there's a lot of deference. So that's our sort of first thing. These are really odd creatures, and teasing out more, are they public, are they private? And if so, what sort of follows on from that is a whole body of work that we're working on. The second thing is that these were created at a very different time in our power market. The power market was dominated by investor-owned utilities at that point, mostly on thermal baseload resources, with some peakers also thermal. So we really just mostly had a mix of oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, with some hydro. We had much fewer market participants. And we had pretty clear goals for the RTOs, and that was efficiency and reliability. You fast forward 20 years, many more market participants, many more goods and services, many more ways to deliver power or reduce power demand on the grid. So demand response, energy efficiency, distributed energy resources, battery storage. A lot more renewables, so a lot more intermittent resources, because economically they're becoming the thing to build. This is putting a lot of pressure, not only on the technical aspects of running the grid, but on these governance structures. The same sort of grand bargain that brought these RTOs together is unraveling a bit, because you find a lot more players with a lot more diverse viewpoints trying to reach consensus on issues, or going through a voting process to find an answer on issues. We're also layering on a lot more of what we ask for from the grid, not just efficiency or reliability, but now sustainability issues, equity issues. And so that's sort of the second area of sort of where do we go from here to make sure that these markets reflect better the, who has a say about where the grid is heading and what that grid should look like. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate that insight into these important organizations. And David, over to you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, and it's wonderful to be with you all. Good morning from Indiana. So I'm very happy to briefly tell you a little bit about one of the projects we've been working on, funded by the Sloan Foundation. And it really starts the same place that sort of Bea mentioned in her opening remarks, which is the infrastructure needs we have in energy space in the US are immense, as everybody I think probably knows, right? No matter what your preferred decarbonization pathway looks like, or even if we don't go on a decarbonization pathway in anytime soon, right? We still need to build a lot of new things, right? Whether it's upgrading pipelines or transmission lines, or bringing on new sources of energy to the grid. We just have immense needs. And that was kind of the starting point for our project, right? So on one hand, we have we know that we need to invest, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in our energy infrastructure. At the same time, we see in the headlines lots of what seems to be lots of opposition to these projects, particularly what's often characterized as sort of not in my backyard or NIMBY opposition, right? Where local communities are rising up and they are voicing opposition, concern about new projects. And if you read the headlines, seemingly this is a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon, right? It's sort of related to Tanya's work, there's high conflict around lots of projects. Of course, this is not just about renewable energy, which what these headlines suggest, but we see it in other types of energy infrastructure as well. We have local opposition to transmission lines, to pipelines, and we're sort of left this impression that not my backyard attitudes are really common, again, really ubiquitous. So what we wanted to do in our project is sort of test that idea, right? To examine whether or not NIMBY actually is as common as it seems. So that's what we did. And I should note, when we began our project, the academic work on NIMBY attitudes and energy is pretty mixed. There's not overwhelming evidence one way or the other. There's some objections to the very notion that NIMBY is a thing, sort of the idea. There's a lot of questions about this. But one of the reasons we think that there's been such mixed findings in the social science literature on this topic is that there's really heterogeneous research designs. People study one project or one type of technology. They use a particular form of NIMBY, sort of a definition of NIMBY in their survey work. And it makes it really difficult to draw inferences across the board because research designs are so variable. So what we want to do in our project is take sort of a very large systematic comparative approach where we examine a single definition of NIMBY across many different energy infrastructure types. So for us, when we think about what is NIMBY, we sort of go with what we think is the conventional definition, which is that sort of the idea that someone supports the use of a technology or a particular land use in general, but they express opposition when it is to be located near where they live, right, in their community, in their neighborhood. So for example, in the energy space, we could think of, I support more wind energy, but I don't want this proposed wind farm in my town, right? That's kind of the NIMBY attitude that we think people most have in mind. So the questions we had were, well, are these kind of attitudes common? Are there differences across energy infrastructure types, which is to say, if there is NIMBY, do we see it everywhere, or is it just with respect to some types of infrastructure? And if not NIMBY, what then explains support or opposition for projects? So what we did then was conducted sort of a series of surveys, right? And what we do that's different from much of the literature is that we're both going to measure one's general support for an energy type, as well as their specific support for a project, for an actual project that was under consideration at the time of the survey. We did this for 14 different projects, and I'll share with you in a moment here what those projects were, that were located in 6 states. The basic setup here is that we're going to ask people in each of these states about their general attitudes about an energy type. We're going to ask them their support level for a particular project. And then we're going to compare people who are located nearby that infrastructure project to those who are living further away, but within the same state. So on the right here, you see an example of one of our projects, which is the Nexus natural gas pipeline. This is a pipeline that's taking natural gas from the Marcellus Shale and Utica Shale region of Pennsylvania and Ohio and bring it up through the northern part of Ohio into Michigan. And the basic idea here is to examine attitudes among those who both live nearby, as well as those who live further away, and to sort of compare, sort of see if these NIMBY attitudes exist and if they're the same or different for these folks. So in terms of the projects we looked at, there were 14, as I mentioned. They're sort of the full distribution almost of sort of infrastructure types. So we looked at both oil and natural gas pipelines. We looked at one liquefied natural gas terminal. We looked at 5 different kinds of power plants: natural gas, wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear, as well as 4 different transmission line projects. These vary in size, they vary in type, obviously, but the setup is the same. So again, in every case, we're going to survey people who live in and around these projects and then compare their attitudes to people who live further away. Okay, so what do we find? So the big tagline is that we find very little evidence of NIMBYism. In fact, no evidence using that definition I provided a few minutes ago. While there is generally less support for some of the projects, namely the pipelines, when you look at this question of NIMBYism, that lack of support or that less support is no different for people who live nearby from those who live further away, right? So again, by our definition of NIMBY that we're utilizing in this particular research, we're not really seeing sort of a prevalence or widespread sort of phenomenon where these not my backyard attitudes are present. So why are we not finding NIMBY? Well, people certainly have opinions and preferences about particular projects, and sometimes these are about sort of the local environmental or economic costs and benefits of these projects. But those views don't really seem to differ between those who live nearby and those who live further away from these projects, right? So these things, these ideas that we think drive NIMBYism are not more, they're not sort of weighed more heavily, or they're not more present among those who reside closer to these projects. So if there's not NIMBY, what then explains project support? Well, what we find, generally speaking, is that perceptions of local environmental quality matter, as well as trust in energy companies. So the more that you trust the companies that are involved in the development of these projects, the more likely you are to support them. And then finally, concerns about climate change are correlated with these attitudes as well. So that's sort of a brief summary. If you're interested in learning more, I have links to several of the papers we've been writing in this area. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And I just wanted to tell everyone listening, all of the slides will be available afterwards, and we can pull together a lot of the references that people mentioned. There were a few questions back and forth on that. Amanda, it's your turn. Looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Oops, sorry, just put on my video and turned it off. Good morning, everyone. Amanda Orman. I think I'm the practitioner in the group, and so I appreciate being able to go last and hear all the great presentations before me. So I wanted to concentrate on kind of the decision-making part and what happens when you bring forward all these projects and how do they get approved. So as was mentioned by David, to meet climate goals, we are going to have to build clean energy and the associated transmission 2 to 5 times faster than we're building it. And I live in the West, and I do not live in an RTO, so things are different than what Kate had talked about with RTOs, but 2 to 5 times faster to build things, which is a huge hill to climb. The processes for approving different infrastructure vary greatly by area. So for example, if you're going to cite a transmission facility, a transmission line in Arizona, you go through one state board that has the approval authority. In Colorado, it's a county authority to approve a transmission line, and there's 64 counties in Colorado. So there's no uniform throughout the states about how to build different things. And so I think my main point to everybody today is that we have to do early and often engagement by the public, by stakeholders, by people that are impacted, if we're going to expect to build things and be able to work towards meeting climate goals. You know, the question of when do you inform, how much do you have to inform, who do you need to talk to is just such a complicated one. And the state agencies, the county agencies that are tasked with approval, it's a challenge for them. They're strapped for resources. They may not have the right staff to go out and do the public approval. So that's one constraint. And then if we look at developers honestly want to do as little as possible when it comes to early engagement and talking to people about their projects, because a lot of times I think they think if they go out really early stage and talk about their projects, then they may get more pushback on their projects. So you have those constraints as well. I wanted to mention 2 kind of bookends of public engagement that I've seen in my career that kind of are the good and the bad. There was a county in Arizona that wanted to site a landfill, and this was probably 25 years ago, but they owned the land and they went through the engineering process and spent many millions of dollars to come up with the plan for this landfill. And then it was realized by the public that they had not done any public engagement at all. In fact, this county had not even gone and talked to the neighboring property owners that there was going to be a landfill in their area. And, you know, I can't imagine anybody not wanting to know that a landfill was going in their area. Well, the project ended up getting canceled. And I think the county had spent about $10 million in work that had to be completely redone because they thought, we own the land, you know, we're a government entity, we can go do what we want. Absolutely not the case. The other bookend happened about 5 years ago where there was a county that knew that it had to build a transmission line, and they worked with a non-governmental organization to conduct a public process. And what they did is they held a number of different workshops where they asked the public to come in, and they asked the public to actually rate and assign a value to different lands, so they could actually look and see, well, where do people care a little less maybe about the land, or think that it's okay to put infrastructure, versus where are those areas that they really want to remain pristine. So when we think about how do you engage the public, how do you use the research that these good researchers are doing, there's all kinds of different ways and benchmarks between those two. So when thinking about research, I think what's really important is that it helps us be much more effective and efficient when we do talk to the public. That has to do with what the public is worried about, what are the concepts that are top of mind, as David just mentioned, and also words, like how do we talk about these projects? If I'm a proponent of a natural gas pipeline, I'm probably going to use the word natural gas. If I'm against a natural gas pipeline, I might say fracked gas. So what words we use when we go out to talk to the public and try to engage people is important. And then I just wanted to switch quickly to what are we seeing in some of the changes related to public acceptance. So policymakers, people who have to approve these different projects, they've always been in a tough seat, and we wish that people operated on a science basis. Tell me the facts, give me the facts about what's the best course of action. But as an elected official or an appointed official, you always have that political screen and really the individual's opinions about projects and public input, right? Whoever screams loudest a lot of times gets more attention. And so when we think about decision making, all those factors go into it. It would be nice if it was a little more science-based, but often it isn't. We are seeing more polarization and more, I think, walking away from science-based decision making, which I think is problematic for what we have to build, because sometimes we end up building something that may not be the best because there's so much political pressure to do something different. With social media, there is all different ways to now reach the decision makers that weren't available in the past. And so the influence is changing, the communication, the amount of communication to a decision maker is changing. And there's also changes in the public process. We're in COVID now, so a lot of stuff is done electronically, but even before that, how people are showing up to talk about either in favor or not in favor of a project is changing. And I have been horrified when I've read things about people showing up to be for a project or against a project, and you find out later that these were paid actors by a group or a developer to say, I support or don't support a project. That's really challenging when we really don't even know who's talking to us about a project. I think also our processes, they're arcane and they're slow. And we have this imperative now to move more quickly. And so we've got some really fundamental conflicts where we want to make sure we're effectively informing the public about what might be coming, but we know we have to move faster. So we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. And I do think that having the research and knowing where people are concerned, what they're concerned about, can help us be more effective. And we have to make sure that we are spending the time and requiring that our public agencies do accept input from people, because we can get really far down the line on a project and then have it be canceled because the outcry can be so strong. So thanks. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. If I could invite all the panelists to come back in. And I guess you can all see why I'm so excited about this conversation. I wanted to kind of take one group and have them talk to another group, and that's what we're going to do now. And a lot of the questions that I have in my mind are ones that actually bring a couple different projects together, and they actually link well with some of the questions that our audience members have been asking. First, if we could have Tanya and David Both of your research were looking at different projects and different environments. And I'm wondering if you saw any sorts of regional variations. There were questions in the audience chat about regional variations, about types of utilities. Matthias Einberger asked, did the data show anything about conflict intensity towards infrastructure types and how it shifted in recent years? He was looking at Maine in regards to transmission. As someone living in New England, any project seems to be contested. And when I looked at your map, it was all red, any project in northern New England. Other people, Tom Stanton was asking about interest in different types of utilities or cooperatives or other companies. You mentioned the trust component. So if Tanya and David could just help us understand the conflict, the location, but also the different types of actors and how that might vary, I think that would be a really interesting insight and add on to kind of Amanda's story of, how the process happens really matters too.
David, do you want to start or?
Go ahead.
So we definitely saw regional variation, Elizabeth. I mean, you can visually see that on the maps. And then we also statistically looked to see if there was statistically significant differences in the level of kind of conflict around the different infrastructure types that show up by region. And we do see those differences. So, with pipelines, we saw that there's more intense conflict in the West and the Midwest, but kind of depends on what your baseline variable is, but relative to the South, but we do see more kind of intense conflict there. But transmission lines, we see more conflict in the Northeast and the Midwest and the West relative. The South tends to have the kind of lower levels of conflict, perhaps not surprisingly. And then, I think the solar projects, we saw more conflict in the Midwest relative to, again, to the South. But yeah, there are some statistically significant differences, and then there's patterns that you see. And I certainly think it correlates with some of these other variables that we were looking at, like, where are there opportunities for people to have voice? Where are there active kind of interest groups that might be opposed to these types of infrastructure projects? Where might there be some patterns, historic patterns of conflict around infrastructure siting that enable people to mobilize perhaps more quickly? So yeah, I think these regional differences are there, and they're important to understand, but they're also related to then kind of the characteristics of the actors that are involved and their history with infrastructure in these regions.
Thank you very much. David, did your project provide any insights there? I know you're looking at some states more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, the research design we employed doesn't really allow us to say much of anything.
It was a great research
region.
design. When you were describing it, I'm like, these guys are brilliant. This is a super structure. I was very excited about your research design.
I appreciate that. We were really focused on trying to understand, sort of take the idea and see if it sort of translates or is common across different infrastructure types, but we were very selective in our projects because of the difficulty in doing the surveys. But here's what I would say. Is that while we don't find sort of, high levels of not my backyard attitudes, that certainly is not to say that there's not opposition to projects, right? There certainly is, whether it's by people who are abut the actual project themselves, or people in the sort of the hyper local folks around these projects. And where I think you probably do see regional differences would be along a couple of dimensions, right? These issues around energy and climate are more salient in some parts of the country than others, right? So sort of the situation, the discourse that exists when a project is proposed, I think sets the stage for whether or not there's going to be a high level of resistance or conflict, to use Tanya's term, but also just the underlying mobilization that exists, right? The capacity of organizations to quickly organize in opposition, right? We're places where they're used to this. They're accustomed not just to talking about it, but being active. I think you're likely to see more sort of engagement and pushback. So I suspect there is regional variation, but I think for our purposes, you need a different research design to sort of pick that up.
Yeah. One of the questions I had for our policy scholars, Amanda, you brought up the point about how some of the people coming in were kind of paid actors, and Leah Stokes has written a lot about this in her scholarship of kind of astroturfing of different groups. And I'm just wondering, like when you're studying NIMBY and opposition of projects, you use slightly different techniques. And, you know, David, you were looking at kind of real people who live next to a project, whereas Amanda's talking about paid actors who you probably weren't surveying in your sample. I'm just wondering, in our traditional tools for analyzing public policy opposition in NIMBY, how do some of today's practices of kind of astroturfing and funding kind of affect the validity of our research, or what questions should we be asking differently if we're living in such a charged political environment where the process itself is being manipulated in different ways? And I'm wondering if the three of you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think some of it is almost a timing thing, because what we're seeing with the paid actors is actually, it's stagecraft, it's theater, it's trying to get the press on our side. And so, that it's engaging to be able to create a crisis or create an impression that, oh, this project is hugely supported or not. And so I think, it's up to the policymaker to be able to understand who's there. I see in public policy all the time that both on a pro and con side, you're just flooding the public agency with information. So I think it's up to the policymaker to think about who is behind this, right? Like, where is all of this coming? And unfortunately, to me, that happens in real time. And is the research there to inform the public policy maker? Like, that's why early engagement and assessment and testing is important, to give the policymaker a basis, so then they know some information before you get to a real-time hearing, because real-time hearings can get a little crazy.
Well, and Tanya, your work on the media analysis, you were picking up lots of articles, and the press responds to.
Yeah, well, I was gonna kind of piggyback on Amanda's point there. And, I think some scholars who look at conflict and opposition to various types of energy infrastructure have often maybe focused too much on kind of public perception and average public perception. And it kind of goes to David's findings that, this NIMBYism idea is somewhat misguided, and that we really need to pay more attention to coalitions. And we really need to understand, as policy scholars, it's something that Chris Weibel and I have done a lot.
Yeah, you and Chris have done a ton of really cool work here.
Is to understand, who are the advocacy coalitions? How are people, working together in organized groups and interest groups, and how do they then sometimes mobilize the public to engage in those types of processes? But it's challenging to do the research design that we did to try to understand these trends across the country at this kind of high 30,000 foot level. It's very difficult to understand the coalitions when you're looking at 619 projects. You just don't take years. And I think one of the questions that came up in the chat was, did you look at the role of like the Land and Liberty Coalition?
Exactly. Natalie McIntyre asked that question. Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, that we weren't able to look at that this kind of high level. You really need to get into more of the kind of case study approaches to understand, how coalitions are engaging. So there's just trade-offs in terms of, what you can do with your research design when you're trying to understand coalitions at kind of this macro scale versus the more localized site-specific scale. But it's critical. I mean, I think all of the comments and the research we've talked about today has underscored that.
And just tag on one other thing. This is kind of not the topic of the conversation, but it comes down to money. It's like, who's paying to be either support or not support a project, and we've got opposition or support from money that we don't know where it's coming from. So as decision makers, we don't know who's talking to us, and that's a real problem. And I don't know how you go back through the research, except for to do forensics afterwards, to say, who was there, who did show up, and as Tanya was saying, understand more about the coalitions that are actually active.
Well, and I appreciate that there are some policy scholars looking at the role of social media in some of these decisions, but I appreciate also in our studies we didn't consider those. So there was a question on that as well. I want to flip to a place where we don't really have much public engagement, and that's to you, Kate, because I realize that the RTOs are also involved in large scale transmission planning. And that what Amanda brought up, and is that sometimes these projects are process based in their understanding. And I'm familiar with processes over the Midwest where there were coalitions put together to think about best practice transmission planning to try and have footprint level approaches. But I know that in the PJM footprint, it's been a lot more contentious. And much more factious. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective in the RTOs and big infrastructure planning, how you've kind of seen some of these things play out in terms of public participation and acceptance.
Yeah, so I've been finding this really fascinating, because I think when everyone else has been talking about conflicts, they've been talking about hyper-localized conflicts and conflicts that engage or include the public. Whereas conflicts in the RTOs, it's a much smaller universe of players. As I said, most of the public don't even know that these things exist. And so the conflicts are between incumbents and new entrants to the markets, or the transmission owners and renewables who want to have access to the grid, or between the states that feel often on the sidelines because they don't have a formal role in a lot of the RTOs and these RTO processes. As an aside, this is actually a conversation that's pretty live right now with the new Office of Public Participation at FERC. While that was really stood up thinking about, it's been on the books for a long time, never realized, but it's the animating force behind creating it was really around pipeline and much more of the kind of conflicts we're hearing from the other scholars today. There were a lot of comments, and I think the office is now trying to figure out, can we also play a role in letting the public know these RTOs exist and trying to create some more sunlight around them. They range in transparency, but some of them are incredibly, they're not transparent at all. You don't know when their meetings are occurring. They don't post minutes. They don't tell you what they've been discussing. So they're quite closed door cabals in some instances, as some critics call them. On the transmission, I am not as much of an expert on the transmission side, but we have a lot of scholars, as you know, in the network who've been thinking about this. And this, I also saw there was a question about the voluntary nature of RTOs. So
yeah, exactly. That's a nice
really
way to
critical,
think about
right?
them.
Because they only work if enough transmission owners agreed to give over control of their day-to-day wires, or the day-to-day control of their wires. And because these are voluntary, those transmission owners can walk if they don't like what's happening. As a result, a lot of the decision-making processes around transmission planning in the RTO footprints are still quite deferential to the transmission owners. They still sort of generate most of their ideas about where should the next line be built from those transmission owners. Those transmission owners often have their own sort of reasons to have pretty parochial interests around where they think that transmission should be built. And so we find even in the markets, the purpose of them is to be kind of opening up the wires and thinking more holistically around a region about where's the best place to site a transmission line. When you're getting ideas still from each of those member TOs, they kind of come up with lines that work within their own utility service footprint.
And increase the value of their assets and maybe not your assets.
Exactly, yes. And so this has been particularly in PJM, we've seen again, this issue. MISO, as you said, has sort of created this, what they did is basically package up a bunch of the little asks that each of the TOs had and then tried to build coalitions around that. Still not
they're
optimal.
multi-value projects.
Exactly, but we're getting to a better place there. But with all this, it's really interesting, and that voluntary nature issue is the crux of it, because you can only push the TOs so far or they walk. And in fact, before MISO did the multi-value project, there's a new paper out by Alex Klass and Hannah Wiseman, Shelley Welton, and Josh Macy talking about an earlier project, which would have put a lot of costs on Duke Energy and First Energy. As a result, those transmission owners left MISO and joined PJM. And so you see forum shopping by the actors that have the most power in these markets when they are voluntary. And that means this back and forth consensus building process is still weighed pretty heavily in favor of some of the players in order to keep that grand bargain together so that the RTO remains intact.
Well, and I think what we're highlighting here is something about the energy system and sector and these future infrastructure investments that really is multi-level governance, where you may have a county commissioner in charge, as David mentioned, with a siting project and an approval or maybe it was you, Tanya, in Colorado, but then local officials being involved in the meetings in this, but you're looking at then regional infrastructure planning and investments and federal level policies and procedures too. And so,
you know, that's if a local official burns a lot of political capital to get a renewable plant sited, for instance, and then it can't clear a market, right? I mean, that's the need to sort of from the beginning know at all those levels, how are we enabling these projects and not having them run at cross purposes?
and there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that are asking about ensuring meaningful public participation in future infrastructure projects. And I guess I'd like to paraphrase that kind of, at what level for what purpose? And given your research, I mean, you can imagine that there's the siting procedures that we've spent a lot of time talking about in terms of NIMBYism. But as Kate, as you mentioned, the market rules determine whether David's solar plant is going to actually, be value added or not, or if there's no transmission line to Tanya's new project, then that may not be able to connect to the grid either. So this kind of energy system ecosystem that we're talking about. So when you're thinking about where better public participation needs to happen, what do you think the critical levels are? And I'd like to hear from all of your perspectives. Maybe I'll start with you, Amanda, since you've been both a state level official and now working on this. What is meaningful public participation and what kinds of decisions should the public be engaged in?
Okay, so I want an easier question, please.
That was as easy as I could get. It's Thursday.
So I guess somebody had mentioned all politics are local, and I do think that I think we need the both and maybe this is just a bad answer, but I do think we have to think about the local impacts, but then we also have to think about kind of where are we trying to go, and if we don't have a vision of what we're trying to create, how do we know what to do? And one of the things that I think is so flawed in this country is that what is our energy policy? On all of the above, energy is not an energy policy. And so I think we're starting to see states put stakes in the ground of like, I want to be 100% clean. I think that's really going to help, because if we have the political mandate or long-term target, then that helps things flow down to where you can actually think about what needs to be built where to achieve a goal. We haven't had broad goals in this country. I know, Elizabeth, you're in Denmark. Denmark, everybody knows where they're going. They've got clear goals, the whole country. Same thing with Germany. The United States, not so much. It's so bifurcated in what people are thinking about that it's hard to know what to plan. So I do think as we address climate change more holistically from the federal level down to the state, that helps us think about what do we have to build. And when we know what we have to build, then we know like whose permission do we need to go get.
Thank you for that. David or Tanya, do you want to go next? David.
Yeah, I think this is a really big puzzle and a really hard one. And it comes back to something Amanda said, right? Which is, we know from social sciences, I think we also probably, many of us believe from a normative perspective, that it's really important to have not always public acceptance, but public involvement, right? Giving people a voice in decisions that affect them. And that we need to be more inclusive and diverse in who we listen to in these kinds of decisions, right? And government's not always great at doing that. And there's many efforts to try to improve those processes, but those take time. Building trust institutions, whether they be government or private, they take a lot of time. It take repeat interactions, right? These things don't just occur naturally. But we don't have a lot of time, right? That's the conundrum, right? Because we have to make our move towards cleaner energy as fast as possible. And when you add the complexity, the multi-level governance issue, like there's so many different forms where these things have to take place. So I think this is a real puzzle. And I don't know, I guess I don't know specifically if there are good models out there that have sort of resolved this or have done this particularly well. But I think we have to sort of figure out a way forward to do both things well, to go fast, but also be inclusive. And those those can't just be in conflict. They have somehow to come together. So maybe there's good research to be done on that subject. Maybe it's already been done, I'm not aware of, but I think that's where the rubber meets the road on this.
Well, thank you very much for that. Tanya, do you have any thoughts on this? Actually, I know
Yes.
you have some thoughts on this, and I really want to hear them.
I have many thoughts, but I don't have enough time. And I just want to echo what Amanda and David just said too, which are excellent points. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about kind of this conflict idea and some of the tension that can come up when you do engage the public, you open up the floodgates potentially for conflict. But conflict isn't always a bad thing. It can be good. It can be productive. It can be a tool for learning. And I think part of what we have to think about too is how do we, in engaging with stakeholders, not just the public, various types of interested stakeholders, how do we create dialogue and trust building that can lead to productive expression of differences and preferences and ideas that allow us to talk to each other. One of the things we saw in our research is that, at least in the media framing, there's often these debates going on between different sides where they're framing the opponents are framing it this way and the proponents are framing it this other way, and they're not really talking to the same issues. And that
was what Amanda's point was earlier too.
Yeah, that can just lead to intensifying conflict and pushing people into their camps. And so I think a lot of it's also how we productively manage that dialogue, and it's not just simply, hey, everybody come tell us what you want, but how do we really talk to each other and understand where there is alignment, where there isn't alignment, and how do we move forward so that we can move the ball down the road, or as David was talking about. So
I've appreciated the tensions that David mentioned of having venues for engagement can also slow down the process of decision making and actually building as well. And I'm wondering if you've seen places, or if you have examples, Tanya, of places where things have worked a little bit, the processes have worked.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the cases that we looked at where there was more kind of this medium level of conflict, there was sometimes at the beginning some of these debates going on in the planning process or in the kind of siting decisions that were being made. But having a productive dialogue at least early on can then actually speed things up towards the end, so that you're not kind of rehashing these old debates on, in an ongoing way as you're constructing the project and, going through the various stages of development. And so, yeah, I think, again, it's early is important, and how you do it is essential.
Well, and that how you do it, and Kate, is also so big for the RTOs, because there's so many groups, like we talked about, who are voluntary, yes, but so many groups don't have standing or aren't considered legitimate in that decision-making process. And so how do you think, what role public could or should play within RTO decision-making? We have colleagues who think they should be public and colleagues who disagree completely. So, your opinion on this and your insights is really helpful.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's so interesting. I feel like, these institutions, a lot of people who work at RTOs, feel very strongly that their job, they are technocrats. This is a highly complex, dynamic situation, and their number one job is to keep the lights on. And it scares them. And I don't mean this with any disrespect. I think a lot of times it really scares people to open this up to a more public process and have people weighing in who don't understand voltage requirements and other highly technical things. I think we've seen this sort of over time. We saw this with state public utilities commissions that were very used to only hearing from the investor-owned utilities and now have to deal with a broader universe. FERC now deals with a much broader universe than it used to. And now we're kind of getting to the RTOs. I think there's a real question whether they are in some ways too technical for truly engaged participation by general members of the public. I mean, it's hard for me to read the documents and not have my eyes glaze over. I have to remember this matters for bigger reasons.
And don't forget the hundreds of acronyms that are different across
Yes.
each RTO. I mean, you may speak PJMEs, but you're not going to speak MISOEs or
Exactly.
SPTs. Yeah.
It's not even enough to be an expert in one of them. It's like then you're completely out at sea if you go to another one.
Yeah.
But I do think in terms of broader public participation, I think the RTOs could do a better job, and maybe led by FERC or this Office of Public Participation, just being more transparent about what they do, the decisions they make. I mean, having minutes of meetings posted so people understand sort of who the players are and who is saying what, I think could be helpful. Most people are not going to read that, but having that out there and available, I think would be useful. And then, as you said, a lot of our colleagues have been thinking about the ultimate oversight ecosystem here, that particularly after some court decisions, FERC is incredibly deferential to these private entities that have decided on their own, beyond some very broad principles from FERC. They've decided on their own how they decide to change tariffs and create or destroy value. And it is very much this sort of, especially in the Eastern ones, membership driven, closed door, so it's and in voting blocks that were built 20 years ago. And now, the TO block is still just got a few players. The other supplier block in PJM has hundreds of people with very diluted votes. So I think potentially some more oversight. Some of our colleagues, Shelley Welton, is arguing for public ownership of the grid. Others are looking for, is there intermediate ground where FERC could have more oversight? Maybe Congress needs to get involved, given that these creatures are not really spoken to in statute. And so FERC is having to sort of create this sort of, they treat them like public utilities, but not quite. So creating this sort of separate strand of oversight. So I think that might be where public participation could be more involved. And then finally, I'd say the state role. And this has been a lot of the scholars in our orbit, because Elizabeth, yes, you were part of RTOgov too, which I should have said at the outset, but a lot of the scholars in our group have been talking about, the need for democratic processes to be driving this. We have this sort of corporatist model, as Dan Walters was saying yesterday, of RTOs, like the experts are going to make the decisions. There are meanwhile these democratic processes happening where states are deciding to set clean energy goals. And how do we get those two talking? Should states ultimately have more control? Should they have a super vote in these markets? What's the relationship there? And I think that's maybe that proxy for the public participation is probably where we need to be thinking.
Oh, and I'm appreciating from the questions coming in the Q&A how complicated energy decision-making is for people to understand. I mean, there isn't any federal body who's making a great plan of where all the transmission could go, although a lot of engineering colleagues have made these beautiful maps of the supergrid. Actually doing the work and building it takes, state level public utility commissions, and some states county level approval processes, and takes decades. And then figuring out who's going to pay for it and cost allocation. I mean, cost allocation of transmission is blood sport. And so understanding all of these different bodies, and if you're a regulated state or a restructured state, and how that gives you relative power versus this decision and not that decision, it makes having these conversations so contextual. So David, if you're in Indiana and talking about this here, you're having a very different conversation than Tanya without an RTO. And so just appreciating that everything we're talking about with the siting and the access and everything really is so dependent on the locus of decision making. Amanda and David, as people, and Tanya too, as people sitting in the West with David, you're not in the West. Amanda and Tanya are in the West, with risks of drought, with risks of fire, with risks, to the infrastructure that are really shaping kind of energy system decision making. How do you see this in the future? I'll start with Amanda, exacerbating some of these issues of decision making and trade-offs on energy infrastructures.
Yeah, I think the term crisis means opportunity and challenge, I think. And I think that when we have these very visible wildfires or really climate events, my hope is that it kind of coalesces action and interest by people, because they see it happening in their backyard and they know that there has to be a solve. And so I think it compels people to pay attention more and get engaged, which I ultimately think is a good thing. when we have more people participate, it takes longer, but it does build trust. And to me, that's what this is all about, is we have to create the trust to be able to move forward. And it's also what gives me a lot of heartburn these days, is that with kind of like fake people showing up to testify, you know, how do we build that trust? But I think that having goals, having local events that compel people to engage is a positive thing, because we have to include more people. We haven't even touched on equity issues, but more voices in the energy planning, that has to happen. And so I think even though this work is hard and long and slow, it has to be done, because we have so much to build and we have so much change to do to the electricity sector.
That's really optimistic. I mean, there's a comment here on the Silverado fire and how that is there, and asking for science-based decisions on energy infrastructure. And I just wanted to point to you and your experience, because it really always is a coalition of, we're taking the technologies and we're taking this and we're negotiating in public. So it's not like there's one right answer. It's a right answer that's being co-created with the public and with our technologies and such. And as you're thinking about this in Colorado, Tanya, how do you see the landscape in the West evolving in terms of some of these challenges?
One of the things that I see as a challenge in the West, and this kind of came out of some research that I just did recently, also funded by the Sloan Foundation, that was comparing some of the responses to the COVID pandemic in Colorado, Texas, and Mexico, in both oil and gas, but also in renewables. And it seems like we're on this kind of path-dependent approach, where there's this assumption that, oh, the renewable market's doing great, so we're just going to kind of carry on and not worry too much about some of these crises that might be hitting us. And I am concerned a bit about the kind of capacity for this like statewide thoughtful planning approach that Amanda mentioned a couple of points back, to really think through, like, what is our overall goal and strategy for how we push renewable energy forward, how we address climate change. There's kind of this feeling, I suspect that like, oh, the market's going to kind of take care of it. But we forget about all these challenges that are coming up in the governance processes around permitting, around siting, around, the coordination of the different entities. And I think there just needs to be, both more opportunities for participation and engagement with the diverse stakeholders, but also a more concerted effort by states and regional actors to think about how do we treat the system in a more kind of proactive way towards a future that we want to achieve. And what are some of the areas where there's inefficiencies in those governance processes, and where can we leverage some of the efficiencies that we've learned about over the last few years and that we've created, but maybe aren't as widespread, because we have such different ways of doing things by county, by state, by region.
I really appreciate what you just said there, and I wanted to give the other panelists just a 30-second wrap up of what is the future you want to achieve, and where do you see your scholarship linking in with this as you move forward, or your activism, in your case, Amanda. And let's go Amanda, Kate, and then David. Start with Amanda.
Sure, thanks very much.
30 seconds.
I believe in coalition. I believe we have to do the hard work of bringing people in, talking to them, engaging them. And so that's where I think we need to go, because we've got a lot of hard decisions to make. And the bigger the table, the broader the conversation, I think the more lasting and durable the outcomes. And I believe people have to know each other. We have to bring people face to face to build that trust.
Let's hope we can do that soon. David.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, the issues that we're working on, right now are really focused on these justice and equity questions, right? As we move towards a clean energy transition, it's imperative that we do so in a way that has sort of built on a principle of fairness and inclusion, so everybody sort of has a seat at the table. And I think it's really important for utilities, governments, RTOs, everybody not to hide behind the complexity, right? That's not an excuse for not engaging with the public. It's an opportunity to communicate the challenges, and I think having good, open, transparent conversations will help the public understand the complexities, and that's actually not a bad thing.
That's nicely said. Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, I think transmission is the really exciting future that I'd like to think about, and would probably end up linking everyone here as well. I think, you know, we've all kind of gone back to what you pointed out earlier, Amanda, that we don't have an energy policy in this country. And I think you see it in this sort of the interconnection queues and the, you know, stranded renewable assets where they get sited and then you can't quite figure out how to get them to load. So you're seeing a lot of curtailment. I think better transmission planning, FERC has just started a process. We're very much eyes on that with RTOgov and trying to get some transmission thinking out there for, you know, potential inclusion in that docket and some thinking, but really figuring out, I mean, ideally we should be figuring where the best renewable resources are. I saw some talk in there about the desert planning in the Obama administration, figuring out best, including, you know, equity,
But I think the
environmental
transmission
considerations, right? But and then figure out what are the transmission lines we need, how do we get them built?
Transmission. And Tanya, just 2 sentences if we're at time.
Oh, I think I said my 2 sentences when I was talking before. I think we're good. And I would say I echo everything everybody said.
And I want to thank everybody for a super conversation. I mean, these are issues that we all care about so much. I feel it in all of your research. I feel it in our conversations. And I want to thank the audience for super questions. Hopefully we'll be able to type in the others and provide resources in terms of slides, but also the papers that were mentioned here to do. And so, Bea, did you want to come on and say goodbye, or should we just say goodbye here?
Well, thank you all so much. This was a riveting conversation, and I appreciate everybody staying on to hear what the panelists had to say. I hope you can all join us in our next conversation, which is going to be in February, and we will be advertising about it soon. So thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Happy holidays. Stay safe.